Well, first of all, thank you very much indeed. And I would add my apologies to this huge delay. It was quite unexpected on my part, I think because of some computer and connection problems. Anyway, just to, in case you haven't checked my CV, I wouldn't regurgitate a lot of the details, but suffice to say that I only learned my English alphabet at the age of about 10 or 12. So my early education was entirely in Chinese, including classical Chinese. And I sat for my examination on the European history using Chinese brush and ink on Chinese rice paper. But anyway, that was a lot water under the bridge. As for my credentials, right out of Tiananmen Square, I was invited by the United States State Department to visit the US as a sponsor visitor. And I share my views with top flight American corporate top people, including Steve Forbes of Forbes magazine, himself together with his managing editor in his office in Fifth Avenue. And I lasted for an hour and 15 minutes. And also later on in my career, when I was based in London as Hong Kong's de facto ambassador, if Hong Kong was a country, and I got an opportunity to be invited to the palace to meet with Prince Andrew before his current problem, but he was appointed as the UK's chief ambassador for trade, and he invited me to the palace, and I share my ideas on China with him, which resulted in his first visit to China. Anyway, so much for that, and I'll just come to straight to the content of this presentation. It is about a game-changing kind of strategy, which is China's presidency trying to build China 3.0. To understand the background to this, I like to first of all, you got to be aware that China is a civilization. It's more than just a single country built with just one race. So on the left-hand side, you see the Uyghurs. They were very much part of the Chinese races. China's got 56 different ethnic races. Most of them, virtually 95% of them, live in great harmony. And then through all these years, all these dynasties, their culture, their customs have all been incorporated and fused together, which resulted in the Chinese civilization. But then China was had been the world's largest economy for a long time. If you look at the chart, the red part is China in terms of GDP, and the one above it was India. And so by the 1800, China's economy was the biggest in the world, and for a long time it was, along with India, the biggest economy, the most powerful country in the world. It was only during the recent years that China's it's only during the recent years that China faced a long period of decline. And before China's decline, there were such golden ages. For example, the Tang Dynasty. You heard about the Marco Polo exploits and the exploits of the Ming Dynasty admiral Jiang He, who led an armada of trading ships. They were not there to conquer territory, but to spread Chinese culture way back in the 15th century. And even as late as the late 19th century, 19th century, China was still very powerful. You see the last one of these remarks. In 1588, the largest English ships displaced 400 tons, whereas at that time, China had 3,000 tons ships. and as well as China's merchant navy employ 130,000 private ships. So you can see that for a long, long time, China was not only the greatest economy, but was the world's largest trading nation. But then soon, China fortune went downhill with the end, or towards the end of the Qing dynasty, because the Qing dynasty was extremely corrupt and also totally incompetent and neglecting the livelihood of the people, but also the defense of the nation. And then it was not alive to what's happening in the West, the Industrial Revolution. So that ended up with the foreign powers led by the United Kingdom of Great Britain at the time, invaded China, and then along with the Western powers carved up China, establishing a lot of districts and territories in China not subject to Chinese law. And that was a huge humiliation. That was the century of humiliation. And later on, soon later on, after the collapse of the Qing dynasty, that led into a period of turmoil, both in terms of civil war amongst the nationalists, which later fled to Taiwan, and the communists led by Chairman Mao, and then compounded with the almost at the same time the invasion by Japan during the start of the Second World War. So again, China was totally in shambles. So what do we mean by China 1.0 and 2.0, which led to 3.0 under President Xi? Now, China 1.0, of course, it was Chairman Mao who, after managed to win the Civil War and defeated the Japanese and united the whole country. So that was China 1.0, in spite of there were a lot of turmoil and mistakes during his reign at that time. Then China 2.0 was Deng Xiaoping, which opened up China in 1978, trying to enable a few people get rich first, because at that time China was so poor that a lot of the people did not have enough to eat, and some villagers had even to share a pair of trousers, as it were. So that was China 2.0, which later on, of course, included China joining the WTO and so on. Now, China's 3.0 is, of course, President Xi. But before then, China already studied how the great powers rose during the past 500 years, trying to learn the lessons, the mistakes, as well as the opportunities as countries rose, to the extent that they compile this kind of TV documentary, which later made into a DVD. You can actually get the DVD in China because it was made available to the entire Chinese nation. It was broadcast on China's television. It's a 12-part series involving a lot of interviews with people like Henry Kissinger, and also prime ministers and presidents of European countries, and so on and so forth, and trying to learn how the past great Western powers, for example, Portugal, Spain, which started, of course, the stock market, and the Netherlands and Spain, including the time with the famous Spanish Armada, and then the British Empire, and France with Napoleon, Germany, Japan, and so on and so forth. Anyway, so China actually was well aware that it is now proceeding on this trajectory, and there are certain various other opportunities as well as risks. Xi Jinping, of course, highlighted the China's 2 centenary goals. The first centenary is the 100th year anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. That was the 100th anniversary is already passed. The goal is almost being achieved, making China relatively well off society. The second centenary, though, is still further down the line. There are a lot of headwinds. The second centenary is the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, when China wants to become prosperous, strong, democratic, underline the word democratic, culturally advanced, and harmonious society. However, of course, as I mentioned, there is a lot of headwinds as well as internal problems along the way, and President Xi is aware of that, and I'll come to that. Actually, what that means, China 3.0. But I'd like to put this trajectory in a broader perspective, in what China is now becoming in the eyes of the world. China is now becoming more assertive and more confident. This is not just rhetoric, because China has become the world's largest trader, ahead of the United States. There are more countries which trade with China compared with the United States, and China has become the world's largest manufacturer. You can see that in terms of the value added in 2021, China accounts for something like 28.7%, compared with the United States 16.8%. China's major strength is lies in the fact that China is now at the central hub, is the central hub of the global supply and value chain. We look at the left-hand side, 7 out of the world's 10 container ports are in China, including Hong Kong. And of course, a lot of the components, they are made in China. And even though the product is not marked in China, but if you look at, say, a Mercedes-Benz, you see that there are electrical components and various kind of parts and so on and so forth made in China, and some automobiles, including Tesla, the electric cars, they are assembled in China. And this centrality of China's being at the center of the world's supply and value chain has been reinforced recently by China joining the regional comprehensive economic partnership, which consists of ASEAN countries and then trading partners, and this RCEP is now been fully functioning, and China is right at the heart of this, the world's largest trading bloc, accounting for 1/3 of the world's population and 1/3 of the world's GDP. China is now, of course, as I seem to have mentioned before, is the largest trading partner for 124 countries, compared with 56 for the United States. And even about 15 years ago, Subramanian, the chief economist of the Peterson Institute for International Economics based in Washington, D.C., had already undertaken a study on the movement of international currencies, along with which currency. In other words, if many currencies move in tandem with a single currency, the currency, of course, is much more influential. And they found that more currencies in the world move up and down with the renminbi, the Chinese currency, than with the US dollar. And of course, there are a lot of projections, and even recently, especially after the pandemics, as China is set to become the world's largest economy by the year 2030 or thereabouts. So this is a huge game changer. And if you look at this, another slide, looking further afield, by the year 2050, China's economy, this is not in purchasing power parity, by the way, because in purchasing power parity, which measures how much money you need to buy the same McDonald's, whether in Ljubljana or in New York or in Beijing, using that sort of measurement, which is called purchasing power parity, China is already the world's largest economy. But using the nominal value nominal terms measurement, by the year 2050, China's economy would have become much larger than the United States. This is not surprising because China's population, because GDP is per capita times the size of the population, and China's population is 4 times as big as the United States. So even China's per capita GDP is slightly more than 1/4. China's economy will be bigger than the United States. So you can see that this again a game-changing kind of dynamic. And of course, plus the fact that China's got a head start in 5G and artificial intelligence. Even the United States Chief Technology Officer acknowledged the fact that China may have been winning or may have won the artificial intelligence battle. It doesn't mean that the AI technology is only happening in China, but China definitely had a head start as well as 5G. And recently, China discovered a huge reserve of methane hydrates. Now, methane, of course, is highly polluting as far as the atmosphere is concerned, but of course it's a highly concentrated form of carbon, and it can produce much more energy than just ordinary gas. And it discovered a huge reserve in the South China Sea, which could last the whole world for 100 years. But it's still early days because it's the first kind of trial, and it will take many, many more years for it to come to fruition. But suffice it to say that energy shortage is not necessarily a constraint. But at least in the short term, China, of course, is still short of energy. But now China has now become a greener superpower. You can see that China is now leading the world in hydro, in wind, as well in solar. Having joined the Paris Agreement, China has now pledged by the year 2030, 26% of its energy will be produced by renewables. Now, China's march trajectory to embrace a greener economy is not just because of for the green skies and polar bears and for the children and children's children. That's important because China's middle class demands a higher quality of life. But more importantly, China suffers from energy security concerns because a lot of the import of oil and gas is through the South China Sea. The South China Sea, there are choke points in the Malacca Strait controlled by the American 7th Fleet. And if push comes to shove, in case of blockade, China will be in huge problem. That's why China is now pivoting towards the west through the Belt and Road, and also developing a kind of energy relationships and partnerships through land-based supply lines. China is also becoming a space superpower, having sent a robotic probe at the back of the moon. I think 2 years, a year and a half ago, is now establishing a space station all by itself, because the American-led International Space Station excluded China, and this American-led space station is coming to the end of its useful life in a couple of years more time. So after a few years, when China has completed the construction of a space station, China's space station will be the only one in the world for some time to come. Now, in the South China Sea, of course, China's got only one one old aircraft carrier, and another one which is nothing compared with the United States. But on the other hand, nowadays warfare is not fought by comparing like with like. It's asymmetric, and China has huge so-called A2AD, which means anti-access, 2As, and area denial capabilities in the form of high-speed supersonic missiles, and also aircraft killer missiles, nuclear submarines, but also building artificial islands armed with missiles and so on, and complete with with drones and also underground mines and so on and so forth, which can deny access to the approach of American aircraft carriers. And also gaining advantage with, as I mentioned, with Russia, with hypersonic weapons, and recently successfully tested what is known as the fractional orbital a kind of bombardment system, orbital bombardment system, which means that the projectile can circumnavigate the Earth. And the important lies in the fact that this trajectory can, this projectile or this system can navigate the Earth from the South Pole to the North Pole. So if it emerges from the South Pole, it will be very difficult for the United States to defend against it, because a lot of American defense assets are in the North Pole. So the United States is very wary of eroded military dominance, as I was trying to explain, in the various warfare domains, land, air, maritime, and so on. Now, China's global ambition is exemplified by this historic Belt and Road initiative. As you can see, the map is really connecting the whole world, complete with various economic corridors. And then there is even a polar Silk Road. The importance of the polar Silk Road is because the Arctic Sea is beginning to the Arctic ice is beginning to melt, making it more navigable to use the passage north of Russia. And if that should happen, the Chinese vessels can use the northern route by passing the choke points in the South China Sea, and would make it easier to reach the other side of the group. Of course, in the European Union, we're just nearer to home as far as most of the audience in this seminar is concerned, China is now developing close relationship with the so-called 16 countries in the European Union. These are usually smaller countries which relied on China Belt and Road. So in the eyes of the European Union, this is China's conquer and divide kind of strategy, or divide and conquer strategy. And in fact, there is some sort of backlash against China from a number of European countries, which think like Lithuania, which think that there is not much investment anyway, and they would like to rely on the West. So this is part of the headwinds China is facing. But on the other hand, countries like Italy captures this Belt and Road, because Italy is trying to position itself as the end of the so-called maritime Silk Road, which ends in Venice, and is from the Venice, and it is positioning itself to pivot towards that part of the Belt and Road which can connect the rest of Europe. And also the same applies to, of course, Greeks, which port has also seen a transformation. Of course, there's a lot of headwind against China's Belt and Road, together with the accusation of the so-called debt trap. But recently, there was a study in the Johns Hopkins University looking at how whether or not the so-called indebtedness is caused by China. You look at the middle graph, the China's loans are only in the blue part. Most of this orange part is already there. In other words, even before they receive loans from China, those countries which seem to be in problems already heavily indebted. But anyway, China is now learning its lesson and is trying to adopt a much more stringent kind of assessment before they extend these loans. Again, there's apart from the physical infrastructure, there's an Arctic Silk Road. There's a digital Silk Road, which actually connects the whole world. And I recommend this book, which I read, this Digital Silk Road on the left. It also describes the digital Silk Road is reinforced, but a lot of connections of underground cables, together with, of course, e-commerce. That, of course, ties in with the investment and trade flows along the Belt and Road. And the whole thing, the China's interconnection, international connectedness is reinforced by the founding of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. A lot of the countries, Western countries, including Britain, were the first to join in spite of America's initial criticism and warning. Again, also supplemented by the founding of the new development bank, the so-called the BRICS Bank. And if we go to Africa, China's all over the place, together with the problems as well as opportunities. Problems in a lot of African countries feel that China's bringing its own labor and trying to not denying a lot of local labor with their employment opportunities and destroying some of the local industry. Opportunity, of course, that China is now lending them loans to build much needed infrastructure, schools, hospitals, highways, power plants. And then Africa is rich in agriculture, but without infrastructure, it's very difficult for a farmer, way out of nowhere to farm their products in markets. China is now a comprehensive partnership with the Middle East as well, and then with the what's happening in Afghanistan. I think that China's footprint in the Middle East is going to even increase further, and this is against the whole world's the swing of the gravitas from the west to the east. It's not only China, but also the rise of India and other ASEAN countries. You can see that the gross domestic product, the share of the world total, is being accounted largely by the developing, emerging and developing Asia as well. It's not just Asia, it's also, you can see the Easternization, whereas countries in other parts of the world, like the Middle East, and even some countries in the region are also rising all the time. However, in spite of all these increase in power and also influence, China has a lot of domestic mountains to climb. According to Premier Wen Jiabao, China's development is unstable, unbalanced, uncoordinated, and also unsustainable. First of all, there was inequality time bomb. China's dollar billionaires in US dollars is 2 million people with investable assets over 10 million renminbi. 12% of household accounted for 12% of household wealth. More importantly, 1% of the Chinese population held 30.6% of China's wealth. While there are 600 million people, according to Premier Li Jiaqiang, with only a monthly income of $1,000 renminbi, and China's Gini coefficient, which measures inequality, is amongst the highest in the world. And then you can see that another problem, of course, is China's population is aging. China's run the risk of getting old before it gets rich because of the one child policy. Again, because of the trade war and the Americans worry that with China's ascendancy, the Trump administration and the Biden administration continue to apply a lot of restrictions on China's semiconductor chips. The bottleneck is the really high end, the so-called 3 nanometer semiconductor chips, which are produced by this single Taiwanese company, TSMC, and the machinery is in the hands of a Holland company, ASML. So China is trying to overcome these bottlenecks by investing hugely in semiconductor research. And there is also the problem of the so-called middle income trap, where a lot of the countries in the past, many decades, find themselves trapped in a range of income, or per capita income between 1,000 US dollars to 12,000 US dollars, and they can never get out of this trap, as in the case of maybe countries in Malaysia, Indonesia, and so on. Now, China is nearly getting out of it, but not entirely. But it's expected that China is able to get out of the middle income trap only by 2025. But then, of course, a lot of headwinds remain along the way. And of course, there is a huge regional disparity in China. The coastal provinces are much more endowed and much more better off than the inner provinces, which of course accommodate most of the Chinese people. And then there's, of course, there's the ecological degradation and water constraint, particularly water. China has got only is 1/5 of the human population, but there's only 10% of the world's arable land and 7% of the world's freshwater resources. And then because of climate change, a lot of the area, and because of desertification, become arid. And there's simply too much water south of the Yangtze River. When through the century, there was a lot of flooding, but north of the Yangtze River, the land was very dry, and then the agricultural production faces a lot of problems. And of course, I mentioned about the industrial pollution as well. China is now facing, of course, a huge problem still with systematic corruption. 4 million officials already been published. And then the battle against corruption has not stopped. For those you interested, I think that I recommend you look at this TV series, which is called In the Name of the People. It's based on some real stories, but this is interesting in the sense that it's not too wooden, because there is a storyline and there's a lot of interesting intrigue, but it's broadcast on Chinese television for everybody, for all the Chinese people. And then the latest one is the Zero Tolerance. And then as far as the young people are concerned, I also recommend this book for those who are interested in China's civil society and the Chinese young people. It's only out in 2021, looking at how the modern Chinese, the Chinese millennials, especially those who are the so-called Z generation Z, born after the year 2000. Because they're very, very different from the old time when China was still poor, and they are born with the internet, and so there is a sense of a pursuit, not only for money and for wealth, but also kind of post-materialistic pursuits, and the demand for self-expression, interest in public affairs and the rule of law, and also harmony in the society. But they seek the middle class a good life, and everybody wants to have their own private property, but also have the elbow room to lead the life or the values they're trying to seek. There's more emphasis on environment, social diversity, gender equality, education equality, because education is extremely unequal in China. If you don't get into the elite universities, you won't be able to achieve very much. But then the competition is so keen, and then a lot of that depends on maybe wealth, maybe jobs, maybe connections, and of course a lot greater emphasis on the rule of law and democracy, but not necessarily wanting to copy the Western type of democracy. Again, because of the difficulty of finding, of owning their own property, and then even starting up their own business and gather more wealth. More and more young people are beginning to adopt a kind of laid-back kind of lifestyle, because not many people, increasingly, more and more people do not want to adopt this lifestyle defined by the so-called 999, from 9 o'clock in the morning to 9 o'clock in the evening, 6 days a week, with very few holidays. So people just don't want that kind of life. They rather than accepting a lower level of income, they want to seek their own future. Maybe as to go to some of the backward provinces as a nomad or as a backpacker and that kind of thing. Again, that of course there are a lot of global headwinds against China. The so-called Thucydides trap with the United States. When an existing superpower feels threatened, then most times in the world it ended up in war, and the whole world is now in a bit of disarray. What's happening with the Middle East, with the climate change, with the pandemic. As far as climate change is concerned, is of course is coming up close and personal, and that would affect the kind of livelihoods, especially in some of the inner provinces. And as mentioned, regional tensions, including what's now happening in Ukraine, North Korea, and even in the Arctic, there is a kind of rivalry between the Arctic nations, and the emergence of strong men, very, very different, because the countries are much more independent and seeking their own international influence. And then globalization is now increasingly called into question. When China joined the WTO, globalization was generally regarded in the whole world as a good thing. But after many, many years, many countries find that big companies are able to just trample upon the smaller countries, and they neglect the environment or the ecology of those countries, and they bring their money along and dictate the terms. If smaller countries don't like the terms, they take the money elsewhere. So that resulted in a kind of backlash against globalization. And then for some of you may have seen a film called The Constant Gardener, which is based on the storyline that the big pharmaceutical companies are selling kind of semi-expired pharmaceuticals and drugs to developing countries. And then, of course, there's the rise of populism. Is not based on logic. The people just based on their own feelings against immigrants, against refugees, against people of different ethnic race, and even some of the traditional values are called into question. And concerns like climate change, as well as the morality of capitalism, are coming to the fore. And as mentioned about the millennials, and they're very, very different from my generation. So I'm so-called baby boomers, born in the 1940s, the 50s. The millennials and millennials have their own way of thinking, and very, very different from the older generation. And then around the world, there's a decline in public trust in Western democratic governments, because the democratic governments find themselves increasingly in a kind of internal discord, and the realization also that capital in the 21st century has created great inequality, like the so-called Gilded Age in the United States. You heard about the very rich the barons and the railroad barons, the big bankers, and so on and so forth. This inequality is now affecting almost the whole world. Then you can see that the world's 26 richest people, 26 richest people in the world, they own as much as the poorer 50% of the entire world together. Just 26 people. You can see how unequal the world has become. And then, of course, there is the disruptive part of global digitization. Because of digitization, a lot of the jobs will be lost, and then not everybody can be retrained. And with American aggressive use of the sanctions, there is a gradual seeping distrust of relying too much on the American dollar, and that could undermine the dominance of the dollar as a weapon for Americans' hegemony. Again, there are global risks even in the year 2022. Ukraine, what's happening? There could be some unintended consequences in the South China Sea, or even whether Biden is going to survive his presidency because of his wealth. And then while this is happening, there is a China scared in the United States. informed by mistrust. They don't trust China, they fear China, and then they deny the reality that China is now becoming more powerful. But without realizing that at the end of the day, America still remains very, very powerful because it is blessed with a unique geography, separated by two oceans, a lot of natural resources, and then it's a much better demographics. Of course, it is a much greater scope and global reach of its military, and the dollar still reigns supreme and is unlikely to be replaced by the renminbi anytime soon. And it's a huge consumer market, which doesn't depend on exports. And of course, the attractiveness of American culture worldwide. So Americans still have a lot of strength, but still they are worried. They are perhaps unreasonably and too much paranoia about Chinese rise, and which is seen to be threatening to a lot of the core values of the so-called US-led liberal order, how to do business without realizing the China's model, of course, very different. It's a state capital economy. Of course, there's a great deal of state intervention, but they don't accept that. And of course, there are also various other kind of perceived erosion in the eyes of the United States. Even in the year 2000, it was 1992. I think you may have heard of this book by Francis Fukuyama. When at that time when China joined the WTO and was seen fully to embrace the Western model, so the theory was that the whole world there's nothing left for any other model, another developing model other than the Western model, and it's called the end of history. But since then, thinking is now changed, and now what we're seeing is more like the clash of civilizations with different values and different kind of development model. But while this is happening, the so-called American supremacy, the American dominance, and the American exceptionalism, founded on the position of America as the shining city upon a hill with a lot of worldwide held values, is now being called into question because of the highest rate of poverty and the kind of money corruption in politics and so on and so forth. And then it seems that the end of American supremacy is gradually coming to an end with the collapse of Lehman Brothers, Americans' withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and the abandoning of the Kurds in Syria, which have the allied forces against Al Qaeda, against the ISIS. However, the so-called attempt to decouple from China is unlikely to reverse this kind of China's dominance in the global supply and value chain, because China simply is too much entrenched in supply lines, in commodity chains and value chains for China to be totally discoupled. Again, you see the emergence of so-called the quadrilateral so-called partnership, or if not alliance, with the United States and also Australia and India and Japan, trying to have a greater grip of their dominance in the South China Sea. But this is unlikely to change the fact that in the regional cooperation economic partnership, which is the third largest trading bloc in the world, China is still at the center. But nevertheless, America continues to push back against China, informed by this very influential book called 100-Year Marathon. The mantra is that China has a secret strategy to replace the United States as the global power, while just demonizing China, resulting in the fact that around the world, increasingly negative views on China. In fact, the measures, anti-China measures, are to such an extent that it amounts to a strategy just short of war. and talks about how the America can continue to push against China over Taiwan, over Hong Kong, over Xinjiang, over the military South China Sea, forming the kind of nuclear alliance with Australia and so on and so forth. And even in space, the NASA has recently developed a strategy, so with a view to founding a kind of station on the moon. So again, on the other side, they're playing up the China implosion kind of rhetoric, saying that because of its China internal problems, China is going to collapse sooner or later. And then they also trying to sort of expand this rhetoric to the fact that if Beijing realizes it's going to collapse, it's going to be even more aggressive. But of course, this it hasn't found a lot of following. You can see that there's a crash of the titans between China and the United States over a lot of kind of issues, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and so on. As I said, the Graham Allison's book called Destined for War, to Sisyphus trap, in a sense that over the several hundred years, in 16 cases of conflict between an existing superpower feels threatened, 12 times it ended up in war. But on the other hand, we see a multipolar world order emerging. As I said, the rise of the East and rise of the developing countries, rise of Russia, even though the economy is not too much to speak of, but nevertheless, Russia is the world's largest energy exporter, and because of its Arctic position and also the military is able to rival the Americans' dominance in a lot of fields. And then even the European Union feels the need to become more independent and not to be beholden to America's coattail. But on the other hand, the perception that Beijing or China is trying to replace the United States as a world hegemon is not founded by reality, because China is not able and not prepared to replicate the US hegemony. Simply, it's nonsense for China to position itself in so many countries around the world, stationing troops. That's not does not characterize China's ascendancy. Whereas China is now focused more on building the China dream and the realization that you can't win just by coercion, because there are many ways to exert your own influence, to realize your own national ascendancy. And then the perception that that China's so-called non-democratic regime is not has a lack or suffers from a lack of legitimacy is belied by the recent Harvard Kennedy School report, which finds that the compared with the United States and other countries, many other countries, the level of people's support is highest compared with a lot of other countries. So the global agenda, with so many challenges, demand a better world order, and the existing G20 and G7 may not serve all the purpose. A need for a stable world order beyond just the question of who's become the world power, and even the United Nations is not able to deliver the goods. But if there's going to be cooperation and competition, but without wars, that demands maybe even a concert of powers, like what happened in the year 1815, the Congress of Vienna, when Western powers came to terms with one another so that they can both compete as well as cooperate. And there's an informal kind of discussion platform. So this may well happen in the future. However, I think that Beijing is fully aware of that. And then in the sixth plenum under the China's Communist Party, the realization is that China is facing unprecedented opportunities as well as risks. And so that accounts for the fact that China is going to build China 3.0. And even comparing, Beijing recently issued a white paper on democracy, comparing China's concept of democracy with the Western concept of democracy, because you can look at what's happening in the United States when both parties fighting each other. A lot of the problems that would benefit the whole country end up in not getting anywhere. The China's type of democracy is focusing on the people, concentrates on the outcome rather than the form, rather than the process. In other words, as the elections is everything. Even after the election, you can have someone who can bring the whole country into chaos. And then as I mentioned in the question of legitimacy, China has lifted 800 million people out of poverty, 16% of the world total. And then even now eradicated entirely the country out of poverty using a higher threshold of $2.3 a day, even higher than that used by the World Bank. Of course, China's governance depends on meritocratic competition. People like President Xi and Li Jiaqiang and all the party secretaries, they've undergone decades of very keen competition before they can rise to their position. And each one of them have presided over governing provinces, some of them bigger than countries. But because of the rising inequality, so there is the emphasis on common prosperity, which does not mean using a Robin Hood style to rob the rich to pay the poor, but trying to create a more level playing field to enable the sort of small businesses and other disadvantaged groups to find their own future. And of course, there was emphasis on the dual circulation, putting more emphasis on internal consumption without depending entirely on exports, which are subject to all sorts of sanctions and kind of blowback. Trying to recalibrate the extent to which China engages with globalization in face of hostile geopolitics, and putting a lot more emphasis on key technology so that China become more self-reliant. And then as far as the so-called democratic cliff, the aging population is concerned, and China is putting a lot of emphasis on the, artificial intelligence, and you don't need too much labor because even nowadays, as you can see from the Winter Olympics, even meals can be cooked by robots, and there are supermarkets and even restaurants without waiters. Above all, China is going to double down on its high-speed rail to 70,000 kilometers by the year 2035, so as to connect the so-called city clusters on the right-hand side map. You can see a lot of the cities are grouped into clusters, and they become a huge dynamic economic kind of community in that region, and connecting them all with high-speed rail would increase the productivity no end, along with digital commerce, and even the digital commerce is going to lift poverty amongst the villages, and the farmers could sell their products even they miles and miles away from the city center, but they can use e-commerce or e-advertising through social media to sell their products worldwide. And China is now, of course, in a trajectory to improve its governance by taking the initiative to join the comprehensive and progressive trade Trans-Pacific Partnership after the departure of the United States, and it was founded by pioneered by countries like Japan and Malaysia and so on and so forth. Because the CPTPP demands a higher standards in terms of governance, in terms of the environment. And then this is encapsulated in the 15 five-year plan. And because of the different younger generation, the more emphasis on connectivity, on high technology, on sustainability. So all these are being written in China's 14 five-year plan. And of course, China still is embracing the world, unlike the Western, some perception that China is now withdrawing to itself, as an exemplified by the Olympics, by the Winter Olympics. And of course, China is now highlighted the Olympic spirit, fair competition, but without necessarily ending up in confrontation. So I'll stop here. I'm sorry I've taken a little bit longer than expected, but I welcome any questions at all. Right.